Wilson High School, located in a suburban town just outside of Chicago, was known for its rich diversity. Students from all walks of life filled the halls, creating a vibrant environment that reflected the melting pot that was America. From the outside, it appeared to be a progressive institution committed to equality and inclusion. However, beneath this polished exterior, subtle cracks began to emerge, especially in the classrooms. Professor Edward Thompson had been teaching English at Wilson High for nearly 3 decades. A man in his early 60s, his tall and imposing figure commanded attention the moment he entered the classroom. His thinning gray hair, neatly combed to the side, and his pressed button-down shirts gave him an air of formality that never faltered. Thompson had a reputation for being strict, adhering to his own traditional methods of teaching. He often spoke of the good old days of education before what he believed was the rise of political correctness. To many students, he was just a stern educator. But to others, particularly students of color, Thompson represented something more insidious, a subtle form of discrimination manifesting through microaggressions that often went unnoticed by the majority of the class. In Thompson's classroom, students noticed a pattern. White students who shared Thompson's traditional views were met with smiles and nods, while those from diverse backgrounds found their voices consistently drowned out, their ideas dismissed. Thompson never outright disrespected anyone in a way that could get him in trouble. His prejudice was more like a shadow that followed students of color, not always visible, but constantly present. It was in the way he ignored their raised hands just a moment longer, the way he dismissed their questions with a quick, "You're missing the point." Still, Wilson High valued him as a veteran teacher, and Thompson, in return, believed he was untouchable. It was a chilly Monday morning in late September when Marcus Johnson first walked into Wilson High School. A transfer student from Atlanta, Marcus was immediately noticeable. At 6 feet 2 inches, with a lean but athletic build, he carried himself with confidence that spoke of self-assurance and resilience. His dark brown skin and neatly trimmed afro contrasted sharply with the sea of mostly white faces that populated the school. Yet, Marcus wasn't fazed. He had always been the new kid, used to navigating unfamiliar spaces. His father's job in education administration had required the family to move frequently, and Marcus had learned to adapt quickly. As he entered Professor Thompson's English class, all eyes turned to him. "We have a new student today," Thompson announced without much enthusiasm. He gestured lazily toward Marcus, barely glancing at him. "Marcus Johnson, you can take the empty seat in the back." Thompson's voice was clipped, and his tone had a sense of disinterest that Marcus had experienced before. It wasn't new to him. He nodded politely, walking towards the seat indicated, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Marcus quickly realized Thompson's gaze followed him, not with curiosity, but with something closer to suspicion. From the moment he entered, Marcus felt the weight of Thompson's scrutiny. He noticed the way the teacher's eyes lingered on him when he raised his hand, only to shift away as though his presence was an inconvenience. Marcus had been in schools like this before, but something about Thompson's demeanor unsettled him. In his first week, Marcus made a point to contribute thoughtfully to class discussions. He was articulate and well-read, particularly in literature, a subject he loved. However, his comments were often met with indifference or, worse, condescending remarks from Thompson. During a discussion about Shakespeare's Othello, Marcus raised a hand to offer insight about the play's racial dynamics. Thompson, without making eye contact, simply responded, "Let's not make everything about race, Marcus. Shakespeare wasn't writing for our modern sensitivities." Marcus clenched his jaw, but said nothing, knowing this was just the beginning. As the weeks went by, Marcus settled into his new school, but something felt off in Professor Thompson's classroom. It wasn't just the casual dismissals or the subtle snubs. It was the consistency with which they occurred. Whenever Marcus made a point during discussions, Thompson would either cut him off, redirect the conversation, or acknowledge his comment in the most superficial way possible. Meanwhile, other students, particularly the white ones, received enthusiastic feedback, even for more simplistic observations. During one class, while discussing The Great Gatsby, Marcus made a connection between the character of Tom Buchanan and systemic privilege. Tom's arrogance and sense of superiority come from his place in society, right? Marcus said. He's emblematic of a system that benefits him, and he doesn't even see it. It's like. Before Marcus could finish his thought, Thompson interrupted him. That's an interesting perspective, but you're overthinking it, Marcus. Let's not bring politics into a literary discussion, he said, his voice tight with disapproval. The room went silent. Marcus's classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. Marcus bit his tongue, resisting the urge to push back. It wasn't the first time Thompson had dismissed him like this, and Marcus knew it wouldn't be the last. What made it worse were the microaggressions, the subtle, cutting remarks that, though seemingly harmless on the surface, carried a deeper sting. On one occasion, Thompson looked directly at Marcus and said, "You speak very well for someone your age." It was a compliment laced with condescension, the kind that made Marcus feel both seen and unseen at the same time. It wasn't about the words themselves, but the insinuation behind them. The other students began to notice too. Some, like Sarah, a girl who often sat 2 seats down from Marcus, would glance at him after Thompson's remarks, her face betraying a sense of discomfort. But most stayed silent, unwilling or unsure how to intervene. Even though Marcus held his head high, the constant belittlement was wearing him down. He found himself withdrawing more and more, speaking less in class despite his love for literature. The classroom, once a place where he had thrived, was becoming hostile ground. One afternoon, after yet another dismissive remark from Thompson, Marcus sat in the back of the room, his fists clenched under the desk. His mind raced with frustration, anger building inside him. This wasn't just about his ideas being ignored. It was about who he was, about the quiet, constant message that he didn't belong. He began to wonder if anyone else was seeing what he was seeing, or if he was alone in this battle. A few weeks later, Professor Thompson introduced To Kill a Mockingbird to the class, a book centered on racism and injustice in the American South. For Marcus, this was an opportunity to finally contribute something meaningful to the class discussion, a chance to explore complex themes of racial inequality that still resonated deeply in society today. He had read the book before and admired how it handled these themes, but he was cautious. After weeks of being dismissed by Thompson, he knew any contribution he made would be met with resistance. As the class delved into the trial of Tom Robinson, Marcus noticed that the conversation remained on the surface. Thompson steered the discussion towards the legal aspects of the case, never touching on the deeper racial dynamics. Frustrated, Marcus raised his hand. Thompson hesitated before calling on him, his expression betraying his reluctance. "Go ahead, Marcus," he said, his tone flat. Marcus spoke confidently, his voice steady. The case of Tom Robinson is a clear reflection of systemic racism. Even though all the evidence points to his innocence, the jury convicts him because they're blinded by racial prejudice. It's not just about this one case. It's about the whole structure of society being built to oppress people of color. Thompson let out a barely audible sigh, then cut Marcus off before he could continue. "That's an oversimplification, Marcus. You're reading too much into it. The book is about individual moral decisions, not about blaming society for everything. We can't just cry racism every time something happens." The tension in the room was palpable. Several students exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the exchange. Sarah, sitting near Marcus, raised her eyebrows in silent disbelief, while a few others avoided eye contact altogether, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Marcus, holding his composure, responded carefully, "But isn't it important to talk about the societal context? Racism isn't just about individual acts. It's about the systems that keep people like Tom Robinson oppressed." Thompson's face hardened. "We're here to discuss the literature, not to have a political debate. Let's move on." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a familiar feeling of frustration washing over him. He had come into the discussion hoping for an open conversation, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen in this classroom. His heart sank as he realized that Thompson wasn't interested in hearing his perspective, and more importantly, that Thompson was shutting down the very conversation the book was meant to spark. The rest of the class sat in silence, a mix of discomfort and confusion hanging in the air. Some students clearly recognized the injustice in Thompson's response, but no one spoke up. Marcus felt more isolated than ever, as if his voice, his experiences, and his identity were being erased right in front of him. After the tense exchange during the discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird, the atmosphere in the classroom became charged with an uncomfortable silence. As Professor Thompson moved on to the next topic, the students' attention was divided. Some stared blankly at their notebooks, while others exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind still racing from the interaction. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, though most avoided direct eye contact. A few students, like Sarah, glanced at him with a look that was part sympathy, part disbelief. She had always been the type to notice the subtle things, and her furrowed brow suggested she understood the injustice of what had just happened. But she said nothing, and neither did anyone else. As the bell rang and the class filed out, Marcus gathered his things slowly, letting the others leave before him. Just as he was about to walk out, Sarah approached him cautiously. "Hey, Marcus," she began, her voice low. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened in class today. I don't think it was right, the way Mr. Thompson shut you down like that." Marcus looked at her and nodded, appreciating the gesture, but he could still feel the weight of the isolation pressing down on him. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly, "but it's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last." A couple of other students stood nearby, clearly overhearing the conversation but saying nothing. Their silence was louder than words. It was the kind of silence that said they were too afraid to get involved, too uncomfortable to speak up. They, too, had noticed Thompson's behavior, but none of them wanted to be the one to challenge a teacher with as much seniority and power as he had. As Marcus walked down the hall, he felt a growing sense of isolation. In the cafeteria later that day, he noticed that some students avoided sitting near him, as though associating with him might somehow make them targets of the same treatment. Others watched him from a distance, curious but unwilling to engage. It wasn't just Thompson's actions that were isolating him. It was the inaction of his classmates. One student, Brian, a popular athlete who often received praise from Thompson, approached Marcus cautiously during lunch. "Hey man," he said, "I saw what happened in class today. Thompson was kind of harsh, but maybe you were pushing it a little, you know? It's just a book. I wouldn't take it so personally." Marcus looked at Brian, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "It's not just about the book, Brian," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about being heard. It's about being treated with the same respect as everyone else." Brian shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I guess. But Thompson's old school, you know? He's tough on everyone." Marcus shook his head. "No, Brian, he's not. He's not tough on everyone, just on some of us." As Marcus walked away, he realized more than ever that the fight wasn't just with Thompson. It was with the entire system, and with the silence of those who saw the problem but chose to look the other way. As the weeks dragged on, Marcus's frustration continued to build. The small, insidious moments of disrespect and dismissal were no longer just fleeting irritations. They had become a daily source of stress. Each time Professor Thompson ignored his raised hand, cut him off mid-sentence, or invalidated his comments with a patronizing tone, Marcus felt the weight of his silence grow heavier. It wasn't just about the class discussions anymore. It was about feeling invisible, about having his intelligence and experience diminished because of the color of his skin. Outside of class, Marcus kept a calm exterior. He went to basketball practice, hung out with the few friends he had made, and maintained good grades. But inside, the resentment was festering. He had spoken to his parents about it. They had always taught him to stand up for himself, but also to pick his battles wisely. His father, the principal of the school, had a lot of influence, but Marcus wanted to handle this on his own terms. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the right to exist in that classroom as an equal. One Friday afternoon, during a particularly heated discussion on the catcher in the rye, Marcus reached his breaking point. Thompson had been praising one of his favorite students, Brian, for what Marcus knew was a superficial analysis of Holden Caulfield's disillusionment with the world. Marcus had spent hours preparing a more nuanced take, ready to challenge the class to see beyond the surface of the character. But when he raised his hand to contribute, Thompson glanced his way, hesitated, and then moved on, ignoring Marcus entirely. Marcus's blood boiled. His hands stayed in the air, and finally, after an excruciatingly long pause, Thompson sighed. "Yes, Marcus? What is it now?" The tone was dismissive, but Marcus wasn't backing down this time. "Holden's disillusionment isn't just personal," Marcus began, keeping his voice steady but his frustration evident. "It reflects a broader societal dissatisfaction. He's struggling with a world that's full of superficiality and lies, yes, but it's also a reflection of the systemic failures around him." Thompson cut him off mid-sentence, waving a hand dismissively. "You're missing the point again, Marcus. Holden is dealing with his own internal struggles, not society's. It's a coming-of-age story, not a commentary on the world around him. You always seem to want to take things to a larger, unnecessary scale." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "No, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice firmer now. "I think you're missing the point. We can't separate personal struggles from the society we live in. Literature reflects the world, and if we're not willing to look at that, we're just skimming the surface." Thompson's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his cold, condescending smile. "Well, perhaps that's your interpretation, but it's not what we're focusing on today. Let's move on." The class sat in stunned silence. A few students looked nervously between Marcus and Thompson, clearly feeling the tension. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his hands shaking slightly under the desk. He had spoken his truth, but it felt like shouting into the void. After class, as the students filed out, Sarah caught up to Marcus again. "That was brave," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. "But do you think it's worth it? He's never going to change." Marcus paused, taking a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't just stay quiet." That night, as Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized he couldn't keep doing this alone. The system was too stacked against him. He needed someone who had the power to make a real difference, and that someone was his father, the principal of Wilson High. It was time to tell him what had been happening in Professor Thompson's classroom. The following Monday morning, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring down at his untouched bowl of cereal. Across from him sat his father, Mr. Johnson, the principal of Wilson High School. The two of them had always been close, but Marcus had hesitated to bring up what had been happening in Professor Thompson's class. He didn't want his father to think he was asking for special treatment, and he didn't want to come across as someone who couldn't handle things on his own. But after the incident on Friday, Marcus realized he needed help, not just for himself, but for future students who might experience the same thing. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. His father looked up from his coffee, concern flickering in his eyes. "What's going on, Marcus?" Mr. Johnson asked, setting down his mug and giving his son his full attention. Marcus took a deep breath and began to explain. He talked about the subtle dismissals, the microaggressions, and the way Professor Thompson treated him differently from his white classmates. His father listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each word. Marcus had never seen his father this quiet. Usually, he would offer advice or encouragement, but this time, he just listened, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished, Mr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Marcus," he began, his voice steady but edged with anger, "why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marcus shrugged, feeling a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I didn't want to involve you, Dad. I didn't want it to seem like I was using you to fight my battles." His father nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his son's words. "I get that, son, but this isn't just about you. This is about every student in that classroom. Thompson has no right to make you, or anyone, feel like their voice doesn't matter." There was a long pause before Mr. Johnson continued. "I'm going to handle this," he said, his voice firm, "but I need you to be prepared for what comes next. Thompson has been at Wilson High for decades. He's got his supporters, but that doesn't mean he's untouchable. What he's doing is wrong, and it needs to be addressed." Marcus nodded, feeling both relieved and anxious. He knew that involving his father would escalate the situation, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about challenging a system that allowed teachers like Thompson to hide behind their authority and perpetuate prejudice. Later that morning, as Marcus walked through the school halls, word began to spread quickly. "Did you hear?" one student whispered to another. "Marcus is the principal's son." For most of the school, it was a shocking revelation. Marcus had never gone out of his way to mention it, and his father had always treated him like any other student. In Thompson's classroom, the atmosphere had shifted. When Marcus walked in, Thompson gave him a brief, tense glance before turning his attention to the lesson. But the air was heavy with an unspoken tension. Thompson had heard the rumors too, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his demeanor. He knew he could no longer brush Marcus off without consequences. As the day went on, Marcus felt the shift in how people looked at him. Some students who had previously stayed silent now approached him with quiet words of support, while others remained distant, unsure of how to react. But one thing was clear: things were about to change. The next day, Marcus was called into the principal's office after first period. His father, Mr. Johnson, had set up a meeting with Professor Thompson, and Marcus knew this was the moment everything would come to a head. He entered the office with a sense of resolve, but also a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Thompson was already there, sitting stiffly in one of the chairs across from Mr. Johnson's desk. His usual air of confidence seemed to waver as he sat, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. "Have a seat, Marcus," Mr. Johnson said calmly, motioning to the chair next to Thompson. Marcus sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. His father looked at both of them, his expression serious but controlled. "We're here today because there have been some concerning reports about the dynamics in your classroom, Mr. Thompson," Mr. Johnson began, his voice steady but firm. Thompson shifted slightly in his chair, his jaw tight. "I don't know what you've heard, but I assure you, there's nothing inappropriate happening in my classroom," he said, his tone defensive but polite. Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow. "I've heard enough to know that there are issues of bias and exclusion that need to be addressed. Marcus has shared his experiences, and frankly, I'm disturbed by what I've heard." Thompson glanced at Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. "With all due respect, Marcus is a bright student, but he tends to read too much into things. He's interpreting my actions in a way that simply isn't accurate. I treat all my students equally, and any suggestion otherwise is a misunderstanding." Marcus clenched his fists under the desk, his frustration bubbling up. Before he could speak, his father leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "This isn't just about one misunderstanding, Mr. Thompson. Marcus has described a pattern of dismissive behavior, of ignoring his contributions, of subtle but consistent microaggressions. And it's not just Marcus who's noticed. Several students have come forward to support what he's been saying." Thompson's face reddened, but he held his ground. "I run a disciplined classroom. I don't pander to students who try to turn every discussion into a political statement. If Marcus feels that I haven't given him the attention he deserves, it's because his points are often off-topic. My job is to teach literature, not to entertain every social commentary that comes my way." Marcus couldn't stay silent any longer. "It's not about being off-topic," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about the fact that you don't listen to me, and when I do contribute, you shut me down. You're quick to praise other students for saying things that don't go as deep, but when I try to offer something meaningful, you act like it's not worth your time." Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Johnson cut him off. "This is exactly the issue, Mr. Thompson. You're dismissing Marcus's perspective, just as you've been dismissing it in class. Whether you realize it or not, your actions are creating a hostile learning environment for students of color, and that is unacceptable." Thompson's face hardened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He looked at Mr. Johnson, clearly aware that the power dynamic in the room had shifted. "I've been teaching here for 30 years, Thompson said slowly, his voice quieter now. "I've always done things the same way, and I've never had complaints like this before." Mr. Johnson's gaze didn't waver. "That doesn't make it right. Times have changed, and so must the way we approach education. What might have gone unnoticed years ago is now being recognized for what it is: bias. Whether intentional or not, it needs to stop." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Thompson sat back in his chair, clearly grappling with the gravity of the situation. "I didn't realize it was being taken that way," he said finally, his tone softer, almost reluctant. Mr. Johnson nodded. "That's why we're having this conversation. But it's not enough to simply acknowledge the problem. There are going to be consequences." Thompson's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing as Mr. Johnson continued. "You'll be suspended from teaching for 2 weeks, and when you return, you'll be required to attend a series of workshops on diversity and inclusion. I expect you to take this seriously, Mr. Thompson, because if there's any indication that this behavior continues, there will be further repercussions." Thompson sat in stunned silence. He had never imagined this conversation would end like this. For the first time, he looked truly vulnerable. Mr. Johnson turned to Marcus, his voice gentler now. "Marcus, thank you for coming forward. This was never an easy thing to do, but it's important. You've not only stood up for yourself, but for every student who comes after you." Marcus nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle wasn't over, but it was a start. The news of Professor Thompson's suspension spread quickly through the halls of Wilson High School. Students whispered in hushed tones between classes, and teachers exchanged knowing glances in the staff lounge. Thompson's absence from the classroom was a stark reminder of the confrontation that had taken place, and it sent shockwaves throughout the school. For the first time in his career, Thompson was being held accountable for his actions, and the message was clear. The school would no longer tolerate discrimination, whether subtle or overt. During his 2-week suspension, Thompson's absence was felt by everyone, but perhaps most by himself. For the first time in years, he was forced to reflect on his teaching methods and the biases that had crept into his classroom over time. Attending the mandatory workshops on diversity and inclusion was humbling. He had spent decades believing he was an educator beyond reproach, yet here he was, learning the very lessons he had thought he already knew. In the workshops, Thompson sat alongside other educators from different schools, each one there for a different reason. The facilitators, seasoned professionals in diversity training, didn't allow him to hide behind his years of experience. They asked difficult questions, challenged his assumptions, and pushed him to confront the biases he had long ignored. Thompson found himself grappling with concepts he had never fully considered: systemic racism, unconscious bias, and the ways in which even well-meaning individuals could perpetuate inequality. In one particularly eye-opening session, a facilitator posed a question that struck a chord with Thompson. "Have you ever considered how the students who don't speak up feel when their voices are silenced in subtle ways? When you dismiss them, even unintentionally, you're telling them they don't matter." That thought lingered with Thompson long after the session ended. He thought about Marcus, the way he had silenced him, not just with words, but with years of unexamined assumptions about who was worthy of being heard. He had dismissed Marcus's contributions not because they weren't valuable, but because they challenged the worldview Thompson had held for so long. Back at school, the administration began implementing broader changes. Mr. Johnson, as principal, took the opportunity to push for new policies aimed at addressing the kinds of issues Marcus had faced. A diversity committee was formed, made up of teachers, students, and parents, tasked with reviewing classroom practices, student feedback, and curriculum to ensure that Wilson High was truly fostering an inclusive environment. Classrooms were encouraged to have open discussions about race, privilege, and inequality, conversations that had previously been avoided or dismissed as too political. Teachers were given additional training on how to handle sensitive topics and ensure that all students felt their voices were heard. The school's mission, once a vague statement about inclusion, was now a living, breathing effort that permeated every part of the educational experience. When Thompson returned to teaching, he was not the same man who had walked out 2 weeks earlier. His usual stoic demeanor was replaced by a noticeable humility. In his first class back, the tension in the room was palpable. Students watched him carefully, waiting to see if anything had changed. Thompson stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped in front of him. "Before we start today," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I want to acknowledge that I haven't always been the teacher I should have been. I've learned a lot in the past couple of weeks, and I owe some of you an apology, especially Marcus." He turned to Marcus, who sat quietly in the second row, unsure of what to expect. "Marcus," Thompson continued, I dismissed your ideas when I shouldn't have. I didn't give you the respect you deserved, and for that, I'm truly sorry." The classroom was silent. Marcus looked up, meeting Thompson's eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he nodded, accepting the apology, though the wounds of the past weeks would take longer to heal. The real change, however, wasn't in Thompson's words, but in his actions. From that day on, Thompson made a conscious effort to engage all his students equally, to listen without judgment, and to create a space where diverse perspectives were not just tolerated, but valued. He was still learning, still unlearning the habits of a lifetime, but he was trying. And in the eyes of his students, that effort meant something. Wilson High School was changing too. The conversations Marcus had sparked weren't going away. The new policies, the open discussions, and the school's commitment to inclusion were slowly reshaping the culture of the institution. In the months following Professor Thompson's suspension, Wilson High School became a different place. The subtle, unspoken tensions that once lingered in classrooms began to dissolve as the school administration took active steps to foster a more inclusive environment. The Diversity Committee met regularly, discussing not just Thompson's behavior but the broader culture that allowed such incidents to go unchecked for so long. Students were invited to share their experiences in forums, and their voices were now being heard, truly heard, for the first time. Classroom discussions became more open and dynamic. Teachers were encouraged to approach sensitive topics like race, gender, and privilege with care and nuance, creating an environment where every student, regardless of their background, felt empowered to speak up. Students who had once remained silent in the face of subtle biases began to find their voices, and Marcus was at the forefront of this change. Marcus's journey wasn't easy. After Thompson's public apology, there were moments where he still felt the sting of isolation, particularly from students who didn't fully understand the gravity of what had happened. Some classmates continued to avoid him, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamics, while others admired him for his courage. His friendship with Sarah grew stronger, as she had been one of the few who consistently showed her support. But overall, Marcus felt a weight had been lifted, not just from his own shoulders, but from the culture of the school itself. One afternoon, during a student-led discussion on racism in modern literature, Marcus was asked to share his perspective on the changes happening at Wilson High. He stood in front of the class, his heart pounding, but with a newfound confidence that had grown out of his experiences. "I didn't think my voice mattered," Marcus began, looking around the room. "When I first got here, I thought that if I stayed quiet, maybe things would get better. But I've realized that staying silent only lets the problems continue." What happened in Professor Thompson's class wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About how we, as a community, can choose to confront the things that make us uncomfortable or let them slide because it's easier. He paused, scanning the faces of his classmates. Some nodded in agreement. Others listened intently, clearly moved by his words. "This school is changing," he continued, "but it's not just because of new policies or because teachers are being told to act differently. It's changing because we're speaking up, and that's how real change happens." As Marcus sat down, the room filled with applause. His classmates, including some who had once stayed silent during the conflicts with Thompson, now looked at him with respect. It wasn't just about what he had endured. It was about what he had sparked, a movement toward a more inclusive and understanding school community. Outside of the classroom, Marcus found himself growing in ways he hadn't expected. His relationship with his father deepened as they continued to discuss the challenges of navigating race and identity in a predominantly white institution. Mr. Johnson, once a figure of authority in Marcus's life, became more of a mentor, guiding him not only through the complexities of school politics, but through the broader struggles of life as a young black man in America. As the school year drew to a close, Wilson High had transformed. The culture of silence that had once protected educators like Professor Thompson was replaced by a culture of accountability and growth. The school's administration, under Mr. Johnson's leadership, rolled out new programs focused on equity and inclusion, bringing in guest speakers, hosting workshops, and creating spaces where students of all backgrounds could share their stories. For Marcus, the journey had been difficult, but it had also been empowering. He had learned not only to stand up for himself, but to lead by example. By the end of the year, he had become a respected voice in the school, admired not just for his intellect, but for his courage to demand change. As Marcus walked the halls of Wilson High for the last time before summer break, he reflected on how much had changed, not just in the school, but in himself. He had entered as a confident yet cautious student, unsure of how his voice would be received. Now, he left as a leader, someone who had helped spark a movement and foster a community where every student had the right to be heard. And while the road ahead was still full of challenges, Marcus knew one thing for sure: his voice mattered. And he would never be silent again. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's really emotional.